Hi everyone. In this video I want to briefly talk about two criticisms of EdUBudgie, and in particular the sort of philosophy behind EdUBudgie. The first criticism was made by a gentleman who posted sort of a podcast type of thing. It was a YouTube video that I found, and I think he was in Latin America. It wasn't in English and I had to use captions, so I may have missed something in there. But there were two main criticisms in there, and one of them was that EdUBudgie is too large. It takes too long to download it, especially for areas where the internet speed or bandwidth isn't great. And I totally agree. And for that reason, I took EdUBudgie. I removed some of the educational packages, some of the extra fonts, wallpapers, things like that, and got it down to, I think, 3.4 gigabytes from the 6 gigabytes that the sort of full experience EdUBudgie is. And I'm just calling it EdUBudgie Lite. It's the same thing, it'll install the same way, and I'll probably make a more comprehensive video about that in the future to just show some of the differences briefly. But I totally agree. I mean, EdUBudgie is made specifically for education, and for education in places where schools or school districts tend to be underfunded, and naturally those places are going to, are less likely to have a good high-speed internet connection or a consistent, reliable one. And so offering a smaller ISO is totally reasonable. And so that's why I went and did that. He also mentioned that he thought that I sounded, I think he used the term arrogant in the philosophy, basically in saying that I don't think that open source is ready for education. And maybe I should reword it and say that I don't think education is ready for open source. But I still kind of stand by my comment there. There was another one, though, that I noticed in a popular open source, on a popular open source website, where a teacher mentioned how for 20 years they had been using Gallium OS. And it came out about 2 weeks after my article in Linux Magazine, so I don't know that it was in response to it because they didn't mention EdUBudgie, but they hit on a couple of points from that article and from my website in philosophy. And I wanted to go over some of that. So this gentleman said that they used Gallium OS, and that they've made it work for them in education at this school. And there was a couple of key things in there. One, they said that they use it on Acer C720p Chromebooks, which is exactly what I talk about on my website. So that's kind of why I thought it was in response to mine. I'm not sure, I don't know. And the other thing was a comment that he made about Google Docs. Now, this gentleman teaches K through 8, and again, EdUBudgie is for high school. And I think the comment there was that he was afraid that students would associate Google Office, G Suite, Workplace, whatever you want to call it, with computers. I don't think that's the case. I think that it's a tool that a lot of schools use, and that's why I've got this map here. This shows 2019 market saturation of Chromebooks, use of Chrome OS in education. And I think that EdUBudgie takes a different tact, basically. Hey, if your school is open to using Linux, use it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, not by any means. And use Nextcloud, and use LibreOffice or the Office apps that you can add into Nextcloud or whatever. But my argument is that I think a lot of schools are going to tablets and Chrome OS, and I think that tablets are appropriate for younger students and Chrome OS for middle-aged students, and I think that a full Linux distribution is more appropriate for older students, for high school students, and that's why I made EdUBudgie the way that I did. But that said, there are an awful lot of schools that are using Chromebooks already. And so my opinion is we ought to leverage Google's market saturation, move people into Linux that way by saying, it's virus-free, it's mostly open source, it still works with the whole Google ecosystem. And then at that point, once we've got them locked into using Linux of some sort, then we start saying, hey, by the way, we can get away from Google by going to Nextcloud. We can move away from this thing by going to that thing. And I think it'll be more painless that way, or less painful of a transition, especially in 2021 when we're dealing with COVID already. Now, if a school were to start this 15 years ago, I might say, sure, let's just go with Linux across the board, or 20 or 25 years ago. Of course, it's a different story when you're going from, I don't know, Windows 98 or 98 SE and limited internet speeds and usage, very small amount of Google Meet video conferencing, Zoom video conferencing type of things. There's a big difference between that time and now. Not only has Linux matured, Windows has matured, and the argument becomes different, right? But apart from that, we see what Google has done. I mean, they've got 60% market saturation in the US and Canada. They got, 30, 40% in Europe. Looks like 40 or 50% in Australia. So use that to your advantage. Get people to switch into Linux while maintaining their relationship with Google because they already know how to use it. It's already set up and so forth. And they don't need to worry about buying servers for Nextcloud or server space. They don't need to worry about learning a new system. They don't need to worry about retraining their teachers. And once we've got people stuck onto Linux, giving them the idea of open source, giving them the idea that we don't have to pay licensing fees for those devices, but we still are at the moment for Google, then take and say, let's move you over to Nextcloud and save even more money, get you onto a fully open source system. So again, I don't think it's necessarily that open source isn't ready for education, but that education, by and large, I don't think is ready for open source. Now, I base that on my experience. 7 years in teaching at 3 different schools. Not a hell of a lot of experience, but some. And there's been pushback to change. And pushback to change, in particular, in technology, tends to be costly, tends to require a lot of training. And there are oftentimes teachers who are not highly, amenable to having to learn a whole new system. And so that's basically why I chose to go the way that I went with EdUBudgie. What I find interesting, though, is that with Pop! OS, for instance, they offer the NVIDIA drivers right there. Proprietary, closed source, not Novu. And I don't remember seeing an article about that because it seems to me like it's a far more obvious improvement. Now, with open source in education, I mean, there are some weird things like codecs and media formats and stuff. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, and I might be, getting things like Widevine to work on Chromium has limitations or is difficult. What I want to offer is something that works out of the box on any device connected to a regular Microsoft server-based system so that IT people, so that teachers, so that students can set it up and go and have all the tools that they need right there, and it still interfaces with Google. And again, boil the frogs slowly and move them into Nextcloud and move them into other things later on in time once they've built up some trust. Anyways, that's my opinion, and that's sort of the battle that I'm fighting in the school that I'm at, and have been at the schools that I was at in the past as well. The first school I worked at had Chromebooks back in, I think, 2014 or so. The last 2 schools have not. They're just running Microsoft computers in computer labs and iPads here. But I really think that education will improve, moving to a system where younger students iPads, middle students Chrome OS, older students Linux. And that in time, we could start to see Linux market saturation move more, not market saturation, but market share move in the direction that Chrome has moved. And I don't really think that's a bad thing. I would still call it a win. So if people want to disagree with my philosophy, that's fine. I'm happy for the gentleman who has been using Linux for 20 years. I think that's fantastic. I'm not looking to make enemies, but if I do, I don't really mind. I'm just a guy behind a computer, so it's okay with me. But interestingly, neither of the two of them emailed me. I would have loved to have heard that in an email and actually had the conversation. So there's that. But at any rate, if you like my software, use it. Tell your friends, tell your IT people and your education people and your teachers and so on. And if you don't like it, don't. But I think at least it's another pathway to get Linux and more broadly open source into the hands of more people. And that's my secondary goal. My primary goal is education. And education without necessarily having to use and deal with Microsoft, and certainly not using Mac OS or tablets. But my secondary goal, is to help improve open source and Linux and all of that. But I just feel like that's a fight that's not as simple as telling our school administrators, at least in my case, hey, switch to Linux, it's better. Especially when there's already an install base. They've already spent a lot of money on hardware, on training, on getting people up to snuff. It's a tougher conversation to have for me, I feel. So at any rate, that's a little more of my philosophy. Take it or leave it, love it or hate it. comment about it or don't. Either way, I hope this helps somebody. Have a great day.